Let's turn now to the rapidly evolving situation in Iran. Because the rhetoric is escalating, the streets are quieter, and behind the scenes, the stakes may be higher than ever. President Trump is now openly calling for new leadership in Iran, firing back after a barrage of hostile statements from Tehran's top leadership. In an exclusive interview, Trump accused Iran's current rulers of driving the country into ruin, saying they've relied on violence at a scale the nation has never seen before. Those comments came just days after Iran's leadership labeled Trump a criminal and blamed him directly for recent bloodshed in Tehran. But here's where the picture gets more complicated. Despite weeks of nonstop images showing massive street protests, new reports suggest those demonstrations have slowed in recent days. That doesn't mean tensions have eased. Communication restrictions remain in place. Arrests are still happening, and many analysts believe the quiet may be less about calm and more about control. To break down what comes next, I'm joined by national security analyst and Strat podcast host Hal Keir. The big question on everyone's mind is this: if Trump is calling for leadership change in Iran, does that automatically mean U.S. military involvement, or are there other paths forward? According to Keir, history suggests there are options short of a full-scale invasion. He points to past moments where covert actions, rather than open warfare, played a central role. Given recent public statements and prior confrontations, he says it's reasonable to assume that clandestine activity is already underway, involving not just the U.S., but regional players as well. That said, covert pressure can only go so far. If the goal were to send a loud, unmistakable message of support to Iranian protesters or to directly deter further violence by the regime, that would likely require a much more visible show of force. Sanctions, for example, are already in place and expanding, but they work slowly. They squeeze over time. They don't stop batons or bullets in the streets tomorrow. A direct military strike, on the other hand, would have immediate impact, but it also carries enormous risk. And this is where the dilemma deepens. Would a major strike weaken the regime, or would it ignite a surge of nationalist sentiment that actually strengthens it? Iran has already staged large, government-organized pro-regime demonstrations. Those displays of support may be one reason anti-government protests have faded from view, because authorities flooded the streets to prevent clashes and control the narrative. Military action could flip that narrative entirely, turning internal anger outward and uniting the population against a foreign enemy. That's the psychological battlefield policymakers are wrestling with right now. Meanwhile, Iranian leadership continues to insist that the unrest is being orchestrated from abroad. Trump has been blamed directly. Protest deaths have been framed as the result of foreign interference, not domestic outrage. But is anyone actually buying that? Keir says even Iran's closest partners appear unconvinced. Countries like Russia, China, and North Korea may echo Tehran's talking points publicly, but privately, the explanation rings hollow. Blaming outside forces for the killing of your own citizens is a familiar tactic, but not a credible one. And when you look at Iran's alliances, the reality is sobering. China and Russia are stretched thin. North Korea offers rhetoric, not resources. Venezuela is in no position to help anyone. That leaves Iran increasingly isolated, leaning hardest on Russia, whose attention and capacity are largely consumed by the war in Ukraine. Which brings us to the question viewers ask most often: how likely is this to spiral into a much larger conflict? According to Keir, Trump's own recent experiences are shaping his thinking. He favored swift, high-impact operations that produced dramatic results without dragging the U.S. into prolonged wars. Surgical strikes, rapid outcomes, minimal American casualties. But Iran isn't Venezuela, and it isn't a one-and-done scenario. Iran sits on the Persian Gulf, surrounded by U.S. bases, allies, and vital shipping lanes. Any strike would almost certainly trigger retaliation against American forces, regional partners, or both. And if Gulf nations begin to feel exposed, they could push back against continued U.S. presence, creating a cascade of complications. That's why military planners are focused not just on how to strike, but how to absorb and neutralize what comes next. Missile systems, air defenses, proxy forces, none of it is simple, none of it is fast. And all of it carries real risk to personnel and equipment. So what does de-escalation actually look like? The most plausible path, Keir says, may not involve outside force at all. There are indications, quiet ones, that some within Iran's leadership may be exploring internal change. Possibilities include sidelining hardline religious authority, dismantling parts of the Revolutionary Guard's grip on power, or reshaping the system into something less ideologically rigid. But even that path is fraught with danger. Such a shift would likely resemble a coup more than a reform. It could trigger internal power struggles, or worse, a civil war. Iran's geography and demographics add another layer of risk, with Kurdish, Azerbaijani, and other regions harboring long-standing separatist movements that could seize the moment. In other words, instability in Iran wouldn't be clean or contained. It would be complex, fragmented, and unpredictable. And that's the reality policymakers are confronting right now. Every option carries consequences, every move reshapes the board, and there are no easy exits. What happens next won't just affect Iran or the United States. It could redefine the balance of power across the entire region. And that's why what happens next may be decided less by speeches and more by silence, by what isn't said publicly and what's happening behind closed doors. Right now, both Washington and Tehran are walking a narrow line. Publicly, the rhetoric is sharp. Accusations are flying. Each side is projecting strength for its own audience. But privately, the calculus is far more cautious. No one involved can afford a misstep that turns a volatile situation into a regional inferno. For President Trump, the challenge is threading a very thin needle, applying enough pressure to weaken Iran's leadership without triggering a response that drags the U.S. into another long, costly conflict. Every option on the table, covert action, sanctions, cyber operations, or limited strikes, comes with trade-offs. None deliver instant results without risk. For Iran's leadership, the problem is legitimacy. Even if the streets look calmer, the anger hasn't disappeared. It's been suppressed. History shows that repression can buy time, but it rarely buys stability. The more force the regime uses, the more it exposes its fear of its own people. And that's where the messaging war becomes just as important as the military one. Iran's leaders are desperate to frame this unrest as foreign-driven because admitting the truth, that citizens are rising up on their own, undermines the entire foundation of their rule. If the protests are homegrown, then the problem isn't America. It's Tehran. But that narrative only works for so long, especially when images, testimonies, and leaked footage keep telling a different story. Meanwhile, U.S. allies are watching closely. Gulf nations, European partners, and regional powers all have a stake in preventing escalation. Many of them support increased pressure on Iran, but few want to be caught in the crossfire of retaliation. That tension is shaping every diplomatic conversation happening right now. The military posture reflects that uncertainty. Carrier strike groups don't move quietly. They're signals. They say, "We're ready, but we'd rather not use this." At the same time, they limit Iran's options, forcing its leadership to consider how much it's willing to risk. And make no mistake, any retaliation by Iran wouldn't just target the United States. It would likely hit allies, infrastructure, shipping lanes, and energy markets, sending shockwaves far beyond the region. That's why restraint for now is still holding, but restraint is fragile. What ultimately decides the outcome may not be bombs or sanctions, but fractures inside Iran itself. Power struggles within the regime, economic pressure reaching a breaking point, security forces forced to choose between orders and conscience. Those are slow-moving forces, but they're often the ones that bring real change. For now, the world is watching a standoff defined by pressure without explosion, by threats without follow-through. But history tells us moments like this don't stay frozen forever. The question isn't whether something changes in Iran. The question is how and how much chaos comes with it. And as the days pass, the margin for error continues to shrink.